3 days. That's how long it had been since the heir to the Moretti crime family had swallowed a single drop of milk. The doctors at Northwestern Memorial were trembling not because of the medical mystery, but because of the man pacing the room like a caged tiger. Aldrich Moretti, the capo of Chicago, had a gun on the table and a dying son in the crib. His billion-dollar empire couldn't buy the one thing he needed his son's will to live. But in a greasy, rain-slicked diner on the edge of the city, a waitress named Emma was about to do what the world's best specialists couldn't. She didn't use medicine. She used something far more dangerous, and it would change the fate of the underworld forever. Chicago, October 14th, 11:43 p.m. The rain battered the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse suite at the Langham Hotel, but the storm outside was nothing compared to the silence inside. It was a heavy, suffocating silence that smelled of antiseptic, expensive leather and fear. Aldrich Moretti stood by the window, staring down at the Chicago River. At 32, Aldrich was the most feared man in the Midwest. He controlled the unions, the shipping docks, and the unspoken gambling rings from the Loop to the South Side. He wore a bespoke Brioni suit that cost more than most people's cars. But tonight, he looked like a man who had lost everything. Behind him, the steady, rhythmic beep, beep, beep of a heart monitor was the only sound in the room. Mr. Moretti. The voice was shaky. It belonged to Dr. Alan Evans, the finest pediatrician money could buy. Aldrich didn't turn around. He just watched his reflection in the glass, the dark circles under his eyes, the sharp jawline tight with tension. "Speak," Aldrich commanded, his voice a low rumble. We've tried the high-calorie formula. We've tried the feeding tube, but he keeps regurgitating it. It's not a blockage, sir. We've run the scans 3 times. Physically, there is nothing preventing Leo from eating." Aldrich finally turned. His eyes were the color of cold steel. He walked over to the crib in the center of the room. Inside lay Leo Moretti, 6 months old. The baby was pale, his skin almost translucent. He wasn't crying. He was too weak to cry. He just stared up at the ceiling with wide, glassy eyes that looked too old for an infant. "So you're telling me," Aldrich said, leaning over the doctor, "that my son is starving himself to death, that he has decided to die. It's a psychosomatic response to trauma." "Mr. Moretti," the doctor stammered, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Since your wife's passing last week, the sudden absence of her scent, her voice, some infants experience a form of extreme grief. He has given up." Aldrich felt a sharp pain in his chest, distinct and brutal. His wife Isabella had been gunned down 7 days ago in a botched drive-by meant for him. Leo had been in the car. He had seen the blood. He had heard the screams. "Fix him," Aldrich whispered. "We are doing everything we can to keep his fluids up, but without nutrients." The doctor trailed off as Aldrich placed a hand on his shoulder. It wasn't a comforting gesture. It was heavy like a stone slab. "If he dies," Aldrich said, his voice void of emotion, "you won't even have time to scream." The threat hung in the air. Aldrich looked down at his son. Leo looked like a porcelain doll that had been broken. The IV line taped to his tiny hand seemed like a shackle. "Get out," Aldrich said suddenly. "Sir, everyone, get out. Take the machines. Leave the boy." "Mr. Moretti, he needs monitoring. Get out!" Aldrich roared, flipping a heavy oak side table. The crash echoed through the suite. The medical team scrambled, grabbing their bags and fleeing the room. Within moments, Aldrich was alone with his son. He reached into the crib and scooped the frail bundle into his arms. Leo was terrifyingly light. Aldrich walked to the elevator. His head of security, a massive man named Dante, was waiting in the hall. "Boss, where are we going?" Dante asked, eyeing the baby. "It's pouring rain." "The air in here is dead, Dante," Aldrich said, clutching Leo to his chest. "We're going for a drive. If he's going to die, he's not going to do it in this glass cage." They took the armored Cadillac Escalade. Aldrich sat in the back, rocking Leo, trying to get the baby to take a bottle of warm milk. He pleaded. He, a man who had ordered hits without blinking, was begging a 6-month-old to drink. "Leo, please. Per favore, piccolo. Just a sip. For Papa." Leo turned his head away, his little lips pressed into a thin line of refusal. He let out a weak whimper that sounded like a dying bird. Aldrich felt a tear slide down his cheek. He wiped it away angrily. He needed to go somewhere where people were alive. Somewhere that smelled like life, not medicine. "Pull over," Aldrich ordered. "Boss, this is River North. It's 1:00 a.m. There's nothing open but dive bars, and I see a light. That diner. Pull over." It was a rundown place called Saul's 24-Hour Eats. The neon sign was missing the S, so it just read Al's. It was the kind of place Aldrich would never set foot in greasy, cheap Anonymous. Perfect. Emma Rossi wiped the counter for the 10th time that hour. The smell of stale coffee and frying bacon was permanently etched into her pores. Her feet throbbed in her worn-out sneakers. She was 24, but she felt 50. "Hey, Emma." "Order up on table 4. The cook, a grumpy man named Marco, yelled from the back. "Coming, Marco." She sighed. It was a slow night. Just a couple of truck drivers in the corner and a homeless man she let sleep in the back booth as long as he didn't disturb anyone. Emma adjusted her apron. She was trying to save enough money for a deposit on a studio apartment. Currently, she was sleeping on her cousin's couch, hiding from a past she tried desperately to forget. The bell above the door chimed aggressively. A blast of cold, wet wind swept through the diner, making the napkins flutter. Emma looked up and froze. 3 men walked in. They didn't look like the usual late-night crowd. They wore long black trench coats that looked expensive soaking up the rain. The man in the center was terrifyingly handsome, with dark hair slicked back and eyes that scanned the room like a predator assessing a jungle. But what shocked Emma most was what he was holding. A baby. He was clutching a baby, wrapped in a cashmere blanket against his chest, as if it were a bomb about to detonate. "Table," the man barked. It wasn't a question. Anywhere you like," Emma said, her voice small. The men moved to the large booth in the back, the one farthest from the windows. The 2 other men guards obviously stood with their backs to the booth, blocking the view from the rest of the diner. The leader sat down, placing the baby gently on the vinyl seat. Emma grabbed a pot of coffee and a menu, her heart hammering. She knew trouble when she saw it. These were mafiosi, real ones. She approached the table cautiously. "Coffee." The man Aldrich didn't look at her. He was focused entirely on the baby. "Do you have hot water? Clean water?" "Yes, of course." "Bring a bowl and a towel." Emma hurried back to the kitchen. When she returned, the baby was crying. It wasn't a normal cry. It was a high-pitched, keening sound of pure distress. It sounded like the baby was in hurt pain, or worse, heartbroken. Aldrich looked frantic. He was trying to push a bottle into the baby's mouth, but the infant was thrashing weakly, spitting the milk out. It splashed onto Aldrich's pristine suit, but he didn't care. "Take it, Leo." "Damn it. Take it. Take it." Aldrich shouted, his voice cracking. The entire diner went silent. The truck drivers looked over. Dante, the guard, stepped forward. "Boss, maybe we should go back to the hospital." "No," Aldrich snapped. "They can't help him. Nobody can help him." Emma stood there, the bowl of hot water in her hand. She watched the baby. She saw the arch of his back, the way he squeezed his eyes shut. She saw the father's desperation, the raw panic in his eyes. Something in Emma's chest tightened. She knew that look. She knew that cry. Without thinking, she stepped past the massive guard. "Hey, back off!" Dante growled, his hand moving inside his jacket toward a shoulder holster. "He's not hungry for that," Emma said, her voice surprisingly steady. Aldrich looked up, his eyes blazing. "What did you say, Poom?" "The bottle," Emma said, pointing. "The plastic, the rubber nipple. He hates it. He's grieving, isn't he?" Aldrich went still. The air in the diner dropped 10 degrees. "How do you know that?" "Because he's not looking at you," Emma said softly. "He's looking for someone who isn't there. And you forcing that plastic into his mouth is just reminding him that she's gone." Aldrich stared at her. For the first time, he actually saw her. She had messy brown hair, tied up in a bun, no makeup, and a stained apron. But her eyes, hazel and flecked with gold, were filled with a fierce intelligence. "He hasn't eaten in 3 days, Aldrich admitted the words, slipping out before he could stop them. "If he doesn't eat tonight—" He didn't finish the sentence. Emma set the water down. "Let me try." "Don't touch him," Dante warned, stepping in front of her. "Dante," Aldrich said quietly. "Stand down." "Boss, she's a waitress. She could be—" "I said stand down." Aldrich looked at Emma. "If you hurt him, I will burn this building down with you inside." Emma didn't flinch. "I'm going to the kitchen. I need 5 minutes." She turned and ran to the back. She ignored Marco's protests. She grabbed a small saucepan. She didn't look for the diner food. She looked for the hidden stash Marco kept for his own family meals. She found it. A small bag of pastina tiny star-shaped pasta. She boiled the water. She didn't use the diner's heavy stock. She used a little bit of butter, a pinch of salt, and a single fresh sage leaf she found in the walk-in fridge. She cooked the tiny stars until they were soft, almost a porridge. Then she grated a tiny amount of Parmigiano Reggiano on top the real stuff Marco hid in the back. It was the smell of an Italian childhood. It was the smell of safety. She poured the steaming mixture into a small ceramic bowl and grabbed a silver spoon, not the cheap metal ones the customers used. She walked back to the table. The baby was still whimpering, his face red and blotchy. Aldrich looked defeated, his head in his hands. Emma slid into the booth opposite the most dangerous man in Chicago. She didn't ask for permission. "Give him to me," she said. Aldrich hesitated, then carefully passed Leo across the table. The baby felt fragile in Emma's arms. He squirmed, ready to scream. Emma didn't try to feed him immediately. She brought the bowl close to his face. The steam rose up, carrying the scent of butter cheese and sage. Leo stopped crying. His little nose twitched. His eyes opened wide and wet. Emma began to hum. It wasn't a radio song. It was an old Sicilian lullaby, La Romanina. Her voice was low, throaty, and vibrating against the baby's chest. Aldrich froze. His hand moved to his mouth. That song. It was the song his grandmother used to sing. Emma dipped the spoon into the pastina, blew on it gently, and touched it to Leo's lips. "Come on, little prince," she whispered. "Just a taste. Warm your tummy." Leo hesitated. He looked at Emma. He looked at the spoon, and then slowly, instinctively, he opened his mouth. Aldrich held his breath. Dante watched with his mouth open. Leo swallowed. He didn't gag. He didn't spit it up. He swallowed, and then he opened his mouth for more. "My God," Aldrich whispered. Emma kept feeding him spoon after spoon, humming the melody. The baby ate with a voracious hunger, his little hands gripping Emma's uniform. Color began to return to his pale cheeks. The tension in his tiny body vanished. For 10 minutes, the only sound in the diner was the clinking of the spoon and Emma's humming. When the bowl was empty, Leo let out a soft sigh, rested his head against Emma's breast, and fell instantly asleep. Emma looked up. She found Aldrich staring at her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. It wasn't anger anymore. It was fascination, and something darker. Possession. "Who are you?" Aldrich asked, his voice rough. "I'm just a waitress," Emma said gently, handing the sleeping baby back to him. "No." Aldrich stood up, buttoning his jacket. He signaled Dante. "You were a waitress." He reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out a stack of $100 bills, and slammed them onto the table. It was more money than Emma made in a year. "Keep the change," Aldrich said. "Dante, get the car, and get her coat." Emma blinked. "Excuse me." Aldrich stepped closer, towering over her. He smelled of rain, expensive cologne, and danger. "You're the only thing that kept my son alive," he said, his eyes locking onto hers. "You think I'm going to leave you in a dump like this? You're coming with me." I can't just leave. I have a job I have. You have nothing." Aldrich interrupted. "Until 5 minutes ago, you were nobody. Now you belong to the Moretti family." Before Emma could scream, Dante had draped her cheap wool coat over her shoulders and was guiding, no escorting her toward the door. "Wait!" Emma cried, looking back at Marco, who was cowering in the kitchen window. "Don't worry about him," Aldrich said, opening the door to the rainy night. "I'll buy the building tomorrow." As Emma was ushered into the back of the armored SUV sitting next to the sleeping baby and the Mafia Boss, she realized 2 things. First, she had just saved a life. And second, her own life was effectively over. A new, terrifying one had just begun. The interior of the Cadillac Escalade was quieter than a church, but it felt more like a tomb. Outside, the Chicago storm had turned violent, hammering against the bulletproof glass with a rhythmic fury. But inside, the silence was thick enough to choke on. Emma Rossi sat pressed against the leather door, her knuckles white as she gripped the handle of her worn-out purse. Next to her in the center seat lay the baby Leo, deeply asleep in his car seat, and on the other side of the baby sat Aldrich Moretti. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at his phone, his thumb scrolling through messages with lethal precision. The glow of the screen illuminated his face, the sharp cheekbones, the shadow of stubble that darkened his jaw, and the cruel, beautiful line of his mouth. Emma's heart was beating so hard, she felt sick. Kidnapped. She had essentially been kidnapped. But the man beside her hadn't used zip ties or a trunk. He had used a sleeping baby and a terrifying aura of authority that made saying no feel like a death wish. "Where are we going?" Emma asked. Her voice sounded thin, brittle. Aldrich didn't look up. "Home," That's not my home. It is now, he replied, his tone as casual as if he were discussing the weather. You can't do this, Emma said, a spark of anger cutting through her fear. I have a life. I have a shift tomorrow at 600 a.m. Marco will call the police if I don't show up. Aldrich finally locked his phone and slid it into his breast pocket. He turned his head slowly to look at her. In the dim light of the passing street lamps, his eyes were pools of dark ink. Marco, Aldrich said, tasting the name like it was a cheap wine. Marco has already been compensated. As for the police, I own the precinct captain in River North. No one is looking for you, Emma. A chill went down Emma's spine that had nothing to do with the damp coat she was wearing. Who are you? She whispered. Really? I am the man whose son you just saved, he said, his gaze dropping to the sleeping infant. The hardness in his face softened just for a fraction of a second before the steel walls slammed back into place. And I am a man who pays his debts. You saved Leo. I am saving you. Saving me from what? From poverty, from mediocrity, from smelling like grease and despair for the rest of your life. The car slowed down, turning off Michigan Avenue into the private underground entrance of the Langham Hotel. The heavy steel gates rolled open with a groan, and Dante, the driver, navigated the massive SUV into a reserved bay that looked more like a bank vault than a parking spot. Out, Aldrich commanded. Emma hesitated. She looked at the door handle. For a second, she calculated her odds. Could she run? The ramp was steep, Dante was huge, and outside the city was dark and wet. Don't even think about it, Aldrich said, reading her mind effortlessly. He unbuckled the car seat and lifted Leo with a surprising gentleness. You run, you die. You stay, you live like a queen. It's a simple equation. They took a private elevator. There were no buttons inside, just a biometric scanner. Aldrich pressed his thumb against the glass panel. The machine beeped, and the car shot upward, ascending 50 floors in seconds. When the doors opened, Emma gasped. She had expected an apartment. What she saw was a palace in the sky. The penthouse spanned the entire top floor. The walls were glass, offering a panoramic, rain-blurred view of the Chicago skyline. The floors were Italian marble, cold and pristine. The furniture was minimal modern and looked uncomfortable, dark leather, chrome, sharp angles. There were no family photos, no flowers, no warmth. It was breathtaking, and it was completely soulless. Dante, Aldrich said, handing the sleeping baby to the giant guard. Take Leo to the nursery. Do not wake him. If he stirs, come get her immediately. Dante nodded, cradling the baby with surprisingly tender hands, and disappeared down a long hallway. Now they were alone. Aldrich walked over to a crystal decanter on a side table and poured 2 fingers of amber liquid. He didn't offer her any. He downed it in one swallow, then turned to face her. Let's discuss the terms of your employment. I didn't apply for a job, Emma said, standing near the elevator, clutching her coat tight around her body as a shield. You are the only person Leo has eaten for in 3 days, Aldrich said, pacing slowly toward her. The doctors are useless. The nurses are incompetent. But you have the touch. I don't know if it's magic or luck, and I don't care. You are staying here until Leo is strong again. And if I refuse, Aldrich stopped 2 feet from her. He towered over her, his presence suffocating. You won't, because I know about your brother. The blood drained from Emma's face. The room seemed to spin. What? Luca Rossi, Aldrich recited, his voice flat. Gambling debts. Massive ones. He owes $40,000 to the West Side Irish. They're planning to break his legs next Tuesday. Unless... Emma couldn't breathe. Leave him out of this. I bought his debt 10 minutes ago, Aldrich said, pulling a folded piece of paper from his pocket and dropping it on the floor at her feet. It's gone. Poof. He's free. As long as you are here taking care of my son, your brother is safe. You leave, and the debt returns to its original owners. And they are not as patient as I am. Emma stared at the paper. Tears pricked her eyes, hot, angry tears. He had dismantled her entire life in the span of a car ride. He had stripped her of her choice, using the one thing he knew she couldn't sacrifice: her family. You are a monster, she whispered. Aldrich's expression didn't change. He stepped closer, so close she could feel the heat radiating from his chest. He reached out and touched a loose strand of hair near her face. She flinched, but he didn't pull away. He tucked the hair behind her ear, his fingers grazing her skin, rough, warm, dangerous. I am a father, he corrected her, his voice dropping to a gravelly murmur. And a father will burn the world to ash to save his child. You are just the fuel I need right now. He stepped back, the intimacy breaking like a snapped rubber band. Your room is the second door on the left next to the nursery. There are clothes in the closet. Burn that waitress uniform. Your shift starts now. Don't disappoint me, Emma. He turned and walked toward his study, the heavy oak doors closing behind him with a final echoing thud. Emma stood alone in the center of the multi-million-dollar prison, the sound of the rain against the glass, the only company she had. The nursery was the saddest room Emma had ever seen. It was technologically perfect. There was a state-of-the-art oxygen monitor, a temperature-controlled crib, and a changing table made of imported mahogany. But everything was white. White walls, white sheets, white curtains. It smelled of antiseptic and lemon cleaner, not baby powder or milk. It felt like a laboratory, not a place for a child. It was 3:00 a.m. Emma couldn't sleep. The silk pajamas she had found in the guest room, which were clearly brand new, with the tags still on, felt slippery and cold against her skin. She had wandered into the nursery drawn by a strange instinct. Leo was asleep in the crib, but he was restless. He made small, jerking movements, his tiny fists clenching and unclenching. Emma walked over to the window. The rain had settled into a steady drizzle. She looked at her reflection in the glass. Who was she now? Yesterday she was a waitress scraping by for rent. Today she was the prisoner of Aldrich Moretti, the capo dei capi of Chicago. She turned back to the room and noticed something she had missed before. On the high shelf, tucked behind a stack of unused diapers, was a picture frame. It was face down. Curiosity, dangerous and irresistible, pulled her toward it. She reached up and tilted the frame. It was a black and white photograph of a woman. She was breathtakingly beautiful, with dark, laughing eyes and a smile that seemed to light up the paper. She was holding a newborn Leo, looking at him with such adoration it hurt to witness. Isabella Moretti, the dead wife. She hated this room. Emma gasped and spun around. The frame clattered back onto the shelf. Aldrich was standing in the doorway. He had discarded his suit jacket and tie. His white dress shirt was unbuttoned at the top, revealing the column of his throat, and his sleeves were rolled up, exposing forearms roped with muscle and a faint, faded tawda running down his left wrist. He held a glass of whiskey, his second or third of the night. I'm sorry, Emma stammered. I didn't mean to pry. Aldrich walked into the room. He didn't look angry. He looked exhausted. He looked like a man carrying the weight of a collapsing building on his shoulders. "She wanted to paint it yellow," Aldrich said, staring at the white walls. "Like the sun. She said Chicago was too grey. She wanted him to wake up in the sun every morning." He took a sip of his drink. "I told her yellow was tacky. We argued about it for weeks. I won." He laughed a bitter, dry sound. "I won. And now she's dead, and the room is white, and my son hates it." Emma looked at him. Really looked at him. Beneath the monster who had threatened her brother, she saw a man who was drowning in regret. "It's not too late to paint it," Emma said softly. Aldrich looked at her, surprised by her boldness. "It's just paint, Emma. It won't bring her back." "No, but it might make Leo feel less alone." Aldrich stared at her for a long moment, the silence stretching between them. The air was thick with tension, sexual, emotional, dangerous. He took a step toward her. The scent of whiskey and sandalwood washed over her. "Why did he eat for you?" Aldrich asked, his voice low. "I brought the best specialists in the country. They failed. You walked in with a bowl of pasta and a song. Why?" "Because the specialists treated him like a patient," Emma said, her voice trembling slightly as he moved closer. "I treated him like a baby who missed his mother." Aldrich stopped inches from her. He was so tall, she had to crane her neck to look him in the eye. He reached out his hand, hovering near her face again. But this time, he didn't touch her. He pulled back, his fist clenching. "You have a dangerous way of seeing things, Emma." Suddenly, a sharp cry pierced the air. They both froze. Leo. It wasn't the weak whimper from the diner. It was a scream, a full-lunged, terrified scream. Aldrich moved instantly, rushing to the crib. "Leo! Leo, I'm here! Papa's here!" He reached down to pick up the baby, but as soon as he touched him, Leo arched his back and screamed louder, thrashing against his father's hands. "Shh! Shh! Stop!" Aldrich pleaded, panic rising in his voice. "What's wrong? Is he in pain? Should I call the doctor?" He looked at Emma, his eyes wide with helplessness. The ruthless Mafia Boss was gone. In his place was a terrified father who didn't know how to comfort his own child. "Let me," Emma said. She stepped forward. She didn't rush. She moved calmly, radiating a peace she certainly didn't feel. "Move, Aldrich," she said firmly. He hesitated, then stepped back, yielding his place. Emma reached into the crib. She didn't grab the baby. She placed a hand on his chest, letting him feel her warmth. She began to hum the same song from the diner, La Romanina. "Dormi, dormi, bel bambino." Leo's screams turned into jagged sobs. He opened his eyes, terror-filled and panic-stricken, searching the darkness. Emma scooped him up. She held him differently than Aldrich did. Aldrich held him like he was afraid to break him. Emma held him like she was the only thing keeping him together. She pressed his ear against her heart so he could hear the rhythm. "It's okay," she whispered into the baby's soft hair. "The bad dream is gone. I've got you. I'm not going anywhere." She rocked him, swaying her hips in a slow, hypnotic rhythm. She walked around the room, humming, murmuring soft Italian words that flowed like honey. Aldrich stood by the door, watching. He felt a strange, twisting pain in his gut. It was jealousy. Not that she was holding his son, but that his son found peace in the arms of a stranger, and not in his. But beneath the jealousy, there was something else. relief, overwhelming gratitude. Minutes passed. The screaming stopped. Leo's breathing evened out. He buried his face in the crook of Emma's neck, his tiny hand gripping the silk of her borrowed pajamas. Emma turned to face Aldrich. The baby was asleep again. "He just needed to know he wasn't alone in the dark," she whispered. Aldrich looked at the two of them, the beautiful, defiant waitress and his broken son. In the moonlight filtering through the rain-streaked windows, they looked like a painting of a family that didn't exist. "You should go to sleep," Aldrich said, his voice rougher than usual. "You have a long day tomorrow." "And you?" Emma asked. "I don't sleep," Aldrich said. "I watch." He turned and walked out of the nursery, leaving Emma standing in the white room, holding the heir to the empire, wondering how long she could survive in a house full of ghosts before she became one herself. 3 weeks later. The silence of the penthouse had changed. It was no longer the silence of a tomb. It was the hush of a library or a sanctuary. Emma had stopped asking when she could leave. The outside world, her damp apartment, the debt collectors, the smell of grease at Sal's diner, felt like a fading dream. Her reality now was the rhythm of Leo's breathing, the softness of cashmere, and the heavy, brooding presence of Aldrich Moretti. She stood in the center of the nursery. It was no longer white. While Aldrich was out on business, a euphemism that usually meant violence, Emma had ordered supplies. She hadn't hired a crew. She had done it herself on her hands and knees, scrubbing and taping. The walls were now a soft, buttery yellow, not neon, but the color of morning sunlight. She had painted small, whimsical clouds on the ceiling. She had replaced the sterile curtains with heavy linen ones that let in a warm glow. "What have you done?" The voice came from the doorway. It was low and dangerous. Emma didn't jump. She was getting used to the way Aldrich moved silent as a shadow until he wanted to be heard. She turned around, a paintbrush still in her hand, a smudge of yellow paint on her cheek. Aldrich stood there frozen. He was wearing a dark charcoal suit, his tie loosened. He looked tired. There was a splatter of something dark on his cuff that Emma knew wasn't paint, but she had learned not to ask. "I told you," Emma said, her voice steady. "White is for hospitals. Yellow is for growing." Aldrich stepped into the room. He looked at the walls. He looked at the clouds. His jaw tightened, a muscle feathering in his cheek. This was Isabella's wish. Seeing it realized but by another woman was a knife to his heart. "I didn't give you permission to deface my property," he said coldly. "It's not your property," Emma countered, pointing to the crib where Leo was awake, cooing and reaching up toward a painted cloud. "It's his home. Look at him, Aldrich." Aldrich looked. Leo wasn't crying. He wasn't staring blankly at the ceiling. He was tracking the colors. He was smiling. A real gummy, drooling smile. The anger drained out of Aldrich, leaving him looking hollow. He walked to the crib and reached down. Leo grabbed his finger, a finger that had likely pulled a trigger hours ago, and squeezed it tight. "He likes it," Aldrich whispered, sounding defeated. "He loves it," Emma corrected. "He needed warmth. We all do." Aldrich turned his gaze to Emma. She was messy, wearing paint-stained jeans and an oversized t-shirt. She looked nothing like the polished women he used to parade at galas. She looked real. He reached out his thumb, brushing the smudge of yellow paint on her cheek. The touch was electric. Emma's breath hitched. "You are making it very hard for me to keep you at a distance, Emma," he murmured. "Maybe you shouldn't," she breathed. For a moment the air between them crackled. Aldrich leaned in his eyes, dropping to her lips. It was a gravitational pull, inevitable and terrifying. "Boss!" The intercom on the wall buzzed, shattering the moment. It was Dante. "What?" Aldrich snapped, not moving his hand from Emma's face. "Don Salvi is here. He's early for the sit-down." Aldrich closed his eyes and exhaled deeply. The mask of the capo slid back into place. The vulnerability vanished, replaced by cold steel. He pulled his hand away. "Stay in the room," he ordered Emma, his voice devoid of the warmth it held seconds ago. "Lock the door. Do not come out, no matter what you hear." "Aldrich," Emma asked, fear creeping into her voice. "Salvi is a rival. He's here to discuss a truce, but in my world, a truce is just a lie you tell before you stab someone." He walked to the door, checking his cufflinks. "Keep my son safe." Then he was gone. Emma locked the door, but for the first time she didn't feel like a prisoner locking herself in. She felt like a guardian locking the world out. The sit-down was taking place in the main dining room, a cavernous space with a 20-foot mahogany table. Aldrich sat at the head. Flanking him were Dante and two other enforcers. Opposite him sat Don Salvatore Salvi Romano, the head of the Southside family. Salvi was an older man, rotund with a wheezing laugh and eyes that looked like shark glass. He had brought 4 of his own men. The air was thick with cigar smoke and tension. "We want the shipping routes on the lake," Salvi said, cutting into a rare steak. "You have the Union's Moretti. Let us have the water. It's a fair trade for peace." "The water is mine," Aldrich said calmly, swirling a glass of red wine. "You can have the trucking routes to Indiana. That is my offer." Salvi chuckled, wiping grease from his lip. "You're a greedy man, Aldrich. Just like your father. God rest his soul." Upstairs in the nursery, Emma was pacing. Leo was asleep, but she couldn't settle. She felt a strange buzzing in her ears, an instinct she had honed over 5 years of waitressing in dive bars where fights broke out over spilled beer. She needed water. She had forgotten to bring a bottle into the room. She hesitated at the door. Aldrich had said, "Stay inside." But the nursery tap was running brown old pipes they hadn't fixed yet. She couldn't mix Leo's formula with that. "Just 2 minutes," she whispered. She unlocked the door and slipped into the hallway. The penthouse was quiet, save for the murmur of voices from the dining room downstairs. She crept toward the kitchen, which was connected to the dining area by a service door. As she entered the kitchen, she froze. It was bustling with catering staff hired for the night. But Emma noticed something. She noticed the details. There was a waiter she didn't recognize. He was young nervous. He was preparing a fresh bottle of wine for the table, a vintage Barolo Aldrich's favorite. Emma watched from the shadows of the pantry. She saw the waiter's hands shaking. She saw him pull a small vial from his vest pocket. It wasn't poison. That was too clumsy. He uncorked the bottle. He poured a few drops of the liquid from the vial onto the cork, not into the wine. Emma's eyes widened. It was a contact toxin. If Aldrich touched the cork to inspect it, a common habit of wine connoisseurs, or if the wine touched the tainted cork as it poured, it would be subtle, untraceable until it was too late. The waiter placed the bottle on a silver tray and turned to walk out to the dining room. Emma didn't think. She didn't calculate. She burst through the service doors. The dining room went silent. 10 men turned to look at her. Guns were half drawn instantly. Dante stepped forward, his face furious. "Emma, get back!" Dante roared. Aldrich looked at her, his eyes promising retribution for this disobedience. I told you to stay upstairs. Don't drink it, Emma said. Her voice was shaking but loud. Salvi laughed. Well, well, who is this? The new mistress. She's a pretty one, Aldrich. A bit mouthy, though. The waiter with the tray was frozen near Aldrich's elbow. He looked terrified. The wine, Emma said, walking further into the room, her hands raised. The cork, it's tainted. Aldrich's eyes narrowed. He looked at the waiter. Is this true? She's crazy, the waiter stammered, sweat beading on his forehead. I'm just serving the wine, sir. It's a 1990 Barolo. She's the nanny, Aldrich said to the room, his voice cool. And she used to be a waitress. He turned his gaze to Emma. You better be right, Emma. Because if you interrupt a sit-down for nothing, you disrespect Don Salvi, and that has consequences. Check the cork, Emma challenged. Aldrich stood up slowly. The room was deadly silent. He reached for the bottle. The waiter flinched a microscopic movement, but Aldrich saw it. Instead of taking the bottle, Aldrich grabbed the waiter's wrist. Pour it, Aldrich commanded. Sir, pour a glass for yourself. The waiter's face went white. I'm not allowed to drink on the job, sir. I'm giving you a promotion, Aldrich snarled. Drink! The waiter's trembling became violent. He dropped the tray. The bottle shattered on the marble floor, the red wine splattering like blood. Before the glass even settled, the waiter lunged for his pocket, pulling a jagged switchblade. He's mine, the waiter screamed, lunging not at Aldrich, but at Emma, the witness. No, Aldrich roared. But the distance was too great. The waiter was 3 feet from Emma. The blade arced toward her stomach. Emma didn't scream. She did the only thing she knew how to do. She grabbed the heavy silver water pitcher from the side table and swung it with all her might. Crack! The pitcher connected with the waiter's temple. He crumpled to the floor, unconscious, the knife skittering away. Chaos erupted. Dante and the guards had their guns on Salvi's men. Salvi's men had their guns on Aldrich. You bring an assassin into my house. Aldrich's voice was a low rumble of thunder. He stepped over the unconscious waiter and walked toward Salvi. Salvi looked genuinely shocked. I swear on my mother's grave, Aldrich, this isn't my guy. I don't use poison. I use bullets. Aldrich stared at the fat man. He believed him. This was too sloppy for Salvi. Aldrich turned to Emma. She was standing over the body, breathing hard, clutching the dented water pitcher. She looked terrified, but she was standing tall. She had saved his life. She had disobeyed him, risked her safety, and taken down an assailant. Aldrich walked over to her. The entire room watched. He didn't care about the guns. He didn't care about the politics. He reached out and took the pitcher from her shaking hands. He dropped it on the floor. Then in front of his men and his enemies, Aldrich Moretti took Emma's face in his hands. Are you hurt? He asked, his voice raw. No, she whispered. I just came for water. You came for water, Aldrich repeated, a dark amusement dancing in his eyes. He looked at the shattered wine bottle. And you found a rat. He turned to Dante. Clean this up. Take this trash. He pointed to the unconscious waiter, to the basement. Wake him up. Find out who sent him. And Salvi, Dante asked. Get him out. The meeting is over. Aldrich wrapped an arm around Emma's waist, a possessive, protective gesture that told every man in the room exactly who she belonged to. Come, he said to her. We're going upstairs. As they walked to the elevator, leaving the chaos behind, Emma felt the shift. She wasn't just the nanny anymore, and she wasn't a prisoner. She was the woman who had saved the king, and the king knew it. The elevator ride up to the penthouse felt like an ascent into a different world. The chaos of the dining room, the shattered glass, the unconscious assassin. The smell of betrayal faded with every floor they passed. Aldrich didn't let go of Emma's hand. His grip was iron tight, his thumb rubbing over her knuckles, grounding himself. When the doors opened, the silence of the penthouse greeted them. But it was different now. It didn't feel empty. It felt like theirs. They walked straight to the nursery. Aldrich needed to see him. He needed to make sure the one pure thing in his life was still breathing. Inside the yellow room, Leo was sound asleep, blissfully unaware that his father had almost died 40 floors below. Aldrich stood over the crib, his chest heaving. He looked at his son. Then he looked at the woman standing beside him. She was still clutching the hem of her paint-stained t-shirt. She was shaking, now the adrenaline wearing off, leaving behind the cold reality of what she had done. "You could have been killed," Aldrich said, his voice fracturing in the quiet room. "So could you?" Emma whispered. "I am supposed to be killed, Emma. That is the life. That is the price of the chair I sit in." He turned to her, his eyes dark with a mixture of fury and awe. "But you are a civilian. You are innocent. You shouldn't have known what a tainted cork looks like." "I know what bad people look like," she said simply. "I've served them coffee my whole life." Aldrich stared at her. For the first time in his life, he felt terrified. Not of bullets, but of the debt he owed her. She had saved his son's life with a bowl of pasta. She had saved his life with a water pitcher. He walked over to a small safe hidden behind a panel in the wall. He punched in a code and pulled out a thick envelope. He walked back to Emma and held it out. "What is this?" she asked. "Your brother's debt," Aldrich said, "and the deed to the building where Sal's diner is located, and a check for $2 million. Emma looked at the envelope, then up at him confused. "I don't understand." "You're free," Aldrich said. The words tasted like ash in his mouth. "The debt is paid. Luca is safe. You have enough money to vanish, to start over, to buy a house in the countryside where no one carries a gun. Dante will drive you anywhere you want to go tonight." Emma took the envelope. It was heavy. It was everything she had ever dreamed of. Freedom, safety, a future without fear. "You're firing me?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I'm saving you," Aldrich corrected. He stepped closer, his hand cupping her cheek, his thumb brushing away a tear. "If you stay, there will be more nights like this. There will be enemies. There will be danger. I cannot lock you in a tower forever. If you stay, you become a target." He leaned his forehead against hers. "Go, Emma. Go while you still can." It was the ultimate twist. The beast was opening the cage. Emma looked down at the envelope. She thought about the studio apartment she wanted. She thought about walking away from the madness of the Moretti family. Then she looked at the crib, at the yellow walls she had painted, at the clouds. And finally, she looked at Aldrich. The man who had been a monster, then a father, and now a man willing to break his own heart to keep her safe. She realized then that safety wasn't about where you were. It was about who you were with. Slowly, deliberately, Emma tore the envelope in half. The sound was loud in the quiet room. Aldrich froze. "Emma!" She tore it again, and again, letting the pieces of paper, the money, the deeds, the freedom flutter to the floor like confetti. "I'm not a waitress anymore," she said, her voice strong. "And I'm not just a nanny. She took a step forward, closing the gap between them. She placed her hand over his heart, feeling the rapid, heavy beat. "Leo needs a mother," she whispered. "And you? You need someone to check the wine." Aldrich let out a ragged breath, a sound of pure, unadulterated relief. He wrapped his arms around her, crushing her to his chest, burying his face in her hair. He held her as if she were the only solid thing in a universe of chaos. "You're insane," he murmured against her neck. "I guess I fit in then," she replied. He pulled back just enough to look at her lips. This time, there was no hesitation, no intercom buzzing, no guards. He kissed her. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was a seal, a promise. It tasted of danger and devotion. It was the kiss of a man claiming his queen. 6 months later, the headline on the Chicago Tribune read, "Union strike averted as Moretti Enterprises pledges millions to city infrastructure." Aldrich tossed the paper onto the kitchen island. He walked over to the stove where the smell of frying bacon and fresh sage filled the air. Emma was there, balancing a laughing, chubby 1-year-old Leo on her hip while she flipped pancakes. Leo was holding a wooden spoon, banging it against the counter with enthusiasm. "Papa!" Leo squealed, seeing Aldrich. Aldrich smiled, a real smile that reached his eyes. He walked over and kissed the top of Leo's head, then kissed Emma. "How is the little boss today?" Aldrich asked. "Hungry." Emma laughed. "He eats more than you do now." Aldrich wrapped his arms around her waist from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder. He looked at the scene. The domesticity. The peace. It was a life he never thought he deserved. A life he had almost thrown away. "Dante is waiting downstairs," Aldrich said softly. "We have to go handle the north side expansion." "Be careful," Emma said, turning to look at him. "Always," Aldrich promised. He touched the small diamond pendant around her neck, a simple star, reminding them of the pastina that started it all. He walked to the door, then stopped and looked back. "Emma." "Yes. What's for dinner?" She smiled, that fierce, intelligent smile that had brought a mafia don to his knees. "Pastina," she said. "It's always pastina." Aldrich chuckled and walked out the door. The King of Chicago was back in business, but for the first time the king wasn't fighting for power. He was fighting for the family, waiting for him at home. And that made him invincible. And that is the story of how a simple bowl of soup and a brave waitress brought the most dangerous man in Chicago to his knees. It reminds us that sometimes the strongest power in the world isn't a gun or money. It's the instinct to nurture, to protect, and to love against all odds. Emma didn't just save a baby that rainy night. She saved a father's soul. In a world full of darkness, she became the light that guided them home. It proves that family isn't always about blood. Sometimes it's about who shows up when you're starving. If this story touched your heart, please hit that like button. It really helps us share more stories like this. And I have a question for you. If you were in Emma's shoes, would you have taken the money and run, or would you have stayed with the Mafia Boss? Let me know your choice in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss a twist. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.